Jake Norris's eyes felt like liquid fire as the scorching sensation struck them. Jake's hands went to his face in a desperate attempt to remove the pepper spray that burned his skin and clouded his eyesight as his scream froze in his throat and he staggered backward, dropping his rucksack onto the sidewalk. The white GI with a Norris family dojo symbol partially spilt out. "I didn't do anything," he gasped between ragged breaths, tears streaming down his red cheeks, mixing with the chemical irritant "stay where you are." The officer barked, his hand still, gripping the canister as he stepped forward, grabbing Jake roughly by the arm. The boy flinched at the contact. His grandfather's lessons on composure momentarily forgotten in the wave of pain and confusion that overwhelmed him just a moment ago. Jake had been walking peacefully toward the dojo, his mind filled with the new techniques he planned to show his grandfather, the legendary Chuck Norris, a connection unknown to the officer who now dragged him toward a waiting police car. The sun shone obliviously bright in sky above the bustling neighborhood, with the laughter of children playing in a nearby yard. The hum of cars passing by and the chatter of pedestrians going about their day continued as if Jake's world hadn't just shattered. Some bystanders slowed their pace, watching with uncomfortable curiosity as a young boy was manhandled by the officer, but no one intervened. Jake's training had taught him to remain centered in chaos. Inhale for 4 counts, ho for 4, exhale for 4. But the breathing techniques abandoned him as panic took hold. "Please, Jake, manage between coughs. My grandfather is waiting for me." The police ignored what he was saying, concentrating instead on apprehending what he thought was a thief who had been caught in the act. The Norris family dojo emblem was on the sidewalk, along with an abandoned rucksack. The officer might have been prompted to look as a police hard door slammed behind him, partially visible on the exposed GI's mute to sate to Jake's exceptional heritage. Confusion and fear filled Jake's head, and the routine afternoon took an extraordinary turn that would put all his grandfather had taught him about justice, strength, and dignity to the test. Chuck Norris himself would soon be thrust into a confrontation for which no one at the precinct could possibly be ready. Not far from where Jake walked, Dan Miller approached the proprietor of a tiny convenience store and asked him about a petty theft that had been recorded. The store owner, an LL guy with thick glasses and a distressed look, quickly motioned towards the candy aisle, stole 3 candy bars, and fled before I could stop him. The proprietor of the store clarified in a frustrated tone. A little boy, perhaps 12 or 13, was carrying a rucksack. Miller, a junior officer who had only been on the force for 6 months, nodded as he made notes in his little pad. He believed that even minor infractions were worthy of attention, and he had been passed over twice for recognition at the precinct. He was determined to show his superiors that he took his work seriously. "Could you describe his attire?" Miller questioned the proprietor, who scratched his head and appeared to be wearing blue trousers and a red t-shirt. It happened so quickly that a woman in the queue, who was also a client, added her thoughts. "I noticed him too, which was good. His backpack was either dark blue or black, and he had dark hair." Even though these details could be used to describe hundreds of children in the area, Miller felt a wave of resolve that this might be a minor case. But it was his case now, and he would see it through. He thanked the witnesses and moved towards the door, looking out the large glass window at the street just as Jake Norris passed by the store. Miller squinted his eyes upon seeing the backpack, even though Jake's backpack was green rather than blue, and he was wearing a gray t-shirt instead of a red one. As he pushed outside into the sunlight, Miller's hand moved his belt where his pepper spray canister sat next to his holstered gun. He felt a rush of excitement as he saw a young boy with a backpack close enough in his mind to think, "I think I see someone who matches a description," he told the store owner before racing towards the door. He had been instructed to approach detainees cautiously, but something inside of him desired more than a straightforward interrogation. He needed action, something to include in his report that would finally catch his sergeant's attention. Since his grandfather had always instilled in him the value of deference to authority, Jake Norris halted at the sound of the officer's stern order. He turned slowly, his face showing curiosity rather than fear. "Is something wrong, officer?" Jake courteously inquired, keeping his hand on his green rucksack officer's strap. Miller's face was set in a hard expression that suggested he had already decided on something. "Where are you coming from?" Miller demanded, ignoring Jake's question. His eyes darted to the backpack. "What's inside?" Jake blinked, perplexed by the animosity that Miller was displaying. "My grandfather's dojo is where I'm going to practice only my martial arts outfit and a little water." Several people passed by, slowed their pace while observing the exchange with worried expressions. Miller's tone was contemptuous, practically making fun of empty pockets. He responded honestly, "Martial arts, huh?" Since I hadn't done anything illegal, Jake paused, wondering why he was being treated like a criminal, sir. Jake continued, "I'm just walking too," his voice beginning to waver a little. "Empty your pockets." Miller's tone, Rose said, "Someone matching your description took merchandise without paying." He then moved closer, invading the boy's personal space as he cut Jake off. Jake's eyes widened. "But I haven't been in any stores today. I went straight from school to my grandfather's, and Miller interrupted him. He reached for the pepper spray, on his belt in a single motion, his patience worn thin by what he thought was resistance. Finally, he said, "Empty your pockets and open that backpack you ordered." Jake carefully made his way to his rucksack zipper, indicating to the compliance officer that something had gone wrong. The officer's annoyance reached a peak, and without warning, he raised a canister and sprayed Jake's face. The burning struck instantly, causing an all-consuming, searing pain that Jake had never experienced before. His martial arts training had prepared him for many things, but this chemical assault seemed to set his face on fire. "I can call my grandfather, and he will tell you." Burning. As Jake staggered backward and dropped his rucksack, his scream rang across the atmosphere. He instantly raised his hands to his eyes, which exacerbated the burning by transferring a residue to his palms. His tears streamed down his ringed cheeks as he gulped in between frantic gasps. "And I did nothing." "Officer." Instead of expressing regret for his hasty behavior, Miller appeared empowered by it, violently grasping Jake's arm as the child tried to make sense of the pain he was experiencing. "This will teach you to comply with law authorities," Miller murmured as he started to pull the confused child towards his patrol car. But Jake was unable to do so at that precise moment. Recall any of the calmness maintenance lessons his grandfather taught him under pressure. All he could feel was anguish, bewilderment, and the mounting knowledge that something profoundly unfair was happening to him. Jake's awareness as an officer was overtaken by the searing anguish in every part of his body. Miller pulled him towards the patrol car, making every step difficult. "Please," Jake cried out between gasps as his legs wobbled beneath him, and the scorching feeling grew worse rather than lessened. Tears were streaming down his face, combining with a chemical residue to create rivers of fire over his cheeks. "Though I can see it hurts before stealing," Miller should have considered that. His response was icy, demonstrating little care for the boy's evident distress. Miller's grasp simply tightened on Jake's arm. On the sidewalk, Jake's rucksack was left behind by the Norris family and the white GI. A woman in a stroller halted her stride and watched the incident with obvious worry, saying, "Officer, is that necessary? He's just a child." Her voice wavered uncertainty as she yelled out the dojo symbol, which was now partially visible where it spilt out. Miller's commanding tone was enough to make the woman pause, then grudgingly proceed on her way while casting a concerned glance back over her shoulder. "Ma'am, please move along. This is police business." Jake frantically attempted to remember his grandfather's lessons on maintaining composure in times of crisis. Chuck had always stressed that mental clarity was more potent than physical prowess, but the pain was too great to concentrate on anything else. "I was able to get my grandfather Jake to say that he would be waiting for me, so please let me phone him and save it." They arrived at the patrol car when Miller yelled, pushing Jake forward. "You can contact anybody you want once we get to the station and resolve this." Jake won when Miller violently shoved him towards the side, causing his shoulder to strike the metal door with practiced motions. "Where do you keep the candy bars?" The officer felt Jake down and looked in his pockets, but all he found was a house, key, and some cash. Seeming more agitated than before, Miller insisted that there be instant proof. As I was making my way to the dojo, a small group of people had gathered to watch the incident unfold in silence. No one spoke up, and their expressions conveyed a mixture of uneasiness and a general reluctance to confront a police officer. I didn't take anything. Jake insisted on breaking his voice. After pushing Jake through the back door, Miller slammed. It shut with such severity that the youngster staggered and fell awkwardly onto the seat. His hands, still clamped against his searing eyes, transmitted a chill of terror through the window to Jake's body. Jake could only make out the hazy outline of his rucksack, which was still discarded on the sidewalk. Inside the backpack, in addition to his GI, was his phone. He no longer has a relationship with his grandfather as an officer. Jake curled up in the back, attempting in vain to wipe the pepper spray from his eyes as Miller got into the driver's seat. The automobile engine roared to life, and they drove away from the curb towards the police station. Chuck Norris was unaware of what was happening to his grandson, Jake Norris, who was the grandson of one of the most powerful men in the world. Jake was sitting helplessly in the back of a police cruiser, wrongly accused, and in pain. The squad car abruptly jerked into the parking lot of the police station as the officer Miller suddenly broke. Jake was jolted forward and then back against the seat while still experiencing a burning sensation in his eyes. Through his blurred vision, he was able to make out the dim outline of the precinct building, which should have represented safety, but now filled him with dread. Miller ordered the back door to be opened, grabbed Jake by the arm and dragged him out of the car. Jake's vision impairment caused him to lose his balance as his feet struck the pavement, causing him to stumble. He muttered, "I still can't see properly," in a sobbing voice. "It's not my problem," Miller stated icily, holding Jake tightly as he marched him towards the station's entrance. Jake's agony was exacerbated by the fluorescent lights. A few officers glanced up from their desks, their faces changing from ones of curiosity to ones of concern as they saw the small boy's face swollen and red, with tears running down his cheeks. Although Jake couldn't see their stares well, he could feel them. Miller led Jake past the main desk, where a sergeant started to inquire about what was happening, but Miller interrupted him by saying that Kurt was dealing with a shoplifter. They came to a stop at a small room with a metal door, which Miller pushed open and pushed Jake into. The room was empty except for a clock that ticked loudly, echoing in the cramped space. Miller said, "Sit," pointing to one of the chairs. Jake tried to center himself once more by taking deep breaths, as his grandfather had instructed him to do. Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 4, exhale for 4. His face felt raw and swollen, and his scorching hand had significantly subsided. In the midst of the commotion, the familiar rhythm offered some solace. Miller abruptly grabbed Jake's chin and started cleaning his face after leaving the room and returning a little while later with a damp cloth. Jake flinched and held motionless due to the harsh motion and pressure on his injured skin, but Miller snapped, his movements growing more violent. The cloth was cool, but Miller handled it roughly. It seemed like he was more interested in getting rid of the pepper spray residue than offering comfort. When he was done, he threw the damn cloth onto the table and gave Jake a wet slap. Miller then said, drawing the other chair close and taking a seat directly in front of Jake, "Let's talk about what you took from that store." "Jake, I didn't take anything." Miller's countenance hardened as he responded, his voice more steady now despite his anxiety. "I told you I was just walking to my grandfather's dojo. We have witnesses who observed someone who fit your description, stealing candy bars. I wasn't the one. Jake stated, "You're calling the store owner a liar because I haven't been in any stores today." The voice of Miller rose once more. "Empty your pockets." I just had a little cash and Jake's house key on the table, so he complied. Miller looked at the objects, obviously annoyed by the lack of proof, but instead of changing his mind, he appeared to grow more adamant. "Where do you put the candy in that rucksack you conveniently left behind?" In the dimension of his abandoned backpack, Jake's heart fell. "My uniform is in there for practice. Could I please call my grandfather right now?" The interrogation room felt smaller by the minute as Miller disregarded the request and narrowed his gaze in preparation for the actual interrogation. Miller drew forward, his face inches from Jake's, his breath heated and his countenance menacing. "I'll ask you again," Miller said. "Where are those candy bars hidden?" Miller replied in a low, menacing voice. Jake tried to keep his cool by, blinking his still irritated eyes. The pepper spray's effect had lessened, but his face was still burning and his eyesight was still a little fuzzy around the edges. "I appreciate that you're doing your job, sir." Drawing on his grandfather's teachings on respect even under trying circumstances, Jake remarked, "I wasn't in that store and I didn't take anything." Jake jumped when Miller slammed his palm on the table. "Don't treat me with such disrespect. I've worked with children like you my entire career." "You believe you can take everything you want, sir?" "My grandfather taught me never to take what isn't mine," Jake said in a quiet but firm voice. "This is your grandfather that Miller made fun of. If he's such a great teacher, why are you stealing candy bars?" Jake briefly became enraged at the contempt exhibited to his grandfather, but he forced it down since Chuck Norris had always taught him that real strength came from restraint rather than emotion. Jake remarked merely in the hopes that the police would halt at the name. Miller let out a loud chuckle. "Indeed, my uncle is Bruce Lee, the youngster from Save the Stories." Realizing that the police wouldn't believe him without evidence, which was in his abandoned backpack bearing the dojo emblem, Jake fell silent. Miller persisted in his interrogation, continually returning to the same charges in the hopes that Jake would finally stop repeating them. The store owner said, "Someone with your backpack. Witnesses spotted you close to the store. If you only confess, we can put an end to this. But that would be dishonest." Jake persisted, "And according to my grandfather, lying about your grandfather damages your identity as a person." As his annoyance mounted, Miller got up and started to pace the little room. "You know what happens to kids who steal? They wind up in juvenile incarceration. Is that what you want?" Jake's face flashed with panic, but he said, "No, sir, then tell me the truth." "I'm telling the truth. I've never stolen anything in my life," Jake said, his voice cracking slightly as he walked to the dojo for practice. Miller leaned, and his tone again changed to something almost conversational, but still menacing. "Here's what I believe happened. You saw those candy bars, you wanted them, you assumed no one was looking, so you grabbed them and fled. But it's not a crime. Just acknowledge it, and we can go on." "Of the century, kid. Where were you coming from before I stopped you?" Jake shook his head, saying that wasn't what happened. "At Westside Middle School, as I was walking from school to my grandfather's dojo," Miller abruptly changed tactics. Miller nodded as though this information was somehow implicating. "The Norris family dojo is located at Oak Street, number 1224. Jake thought Miller was merely acting to intimidate him by writing something in his notepad, but he did so nonetheless. "We'll check your story," Miller stated, although it seemed as though he had no plans to do so. "You're staying right here until then." Jake looked at the wall clock, knowing that his grandfather would be waiting for him shortly. What would happen if he didn't arrive after 30 minutes had gone by and the interview hadn't ended? Miller had left the room for a moment and returned, with a paper cup of water, placing it just out of Jake's reach. This was a small power play that Jake noticed, and his discomfort had progressed from the pepper spray's initial burning to a deep fatigue. His eyes were still red and irritated, but he was also feeling exhausted. Despite this, he sat with his back straight, remembering his grandfather's words. That posture reflected inner strength and that your story didn't add up. Miller swung around the table like a shark, saying, "Don't have any candy bars on you." However, witnesses noticed a child carrying them in a bag, so they assumed there was another boy. Jake made the reasonable suggestion that I wasn't even close to that store until you noticed me passing by. Miller then stopped pacing and leaned over the table, bringing his face close to Jake's. "I believe you may have already eaten those candy bars or hidden them elsewhere after you left the store." Jake stopped lying and shook his head, saying, "I haven't eaten anything since lunch at school." Miller's tone, "We have you on the store security camera," rose, and his tolerance is clearly waning. Jake's eyes widened a little, showing his first evidence of real panic, and then his face returned to one of calm confidence. "No, you don't," he murmured quietly, "because I wasn't present." The water in the cups slashed over the sides as Miller's bluff failed and his annoyance grew. He slammed both palms on the table. "You're not benefiting from this mentality, youngsters. My grandfather says that the truth stands on its own, without assistance. Your grandfather again." Jake took a deep breath and used his martial arts training to stay focused. When Miller asked, "If he's so important, where is he and why hasn't he come looking for you?" It touched a nerve. Jake looked at the clock once more. Since it had been about an hour since he was meant to reach the dojo, his grandfather should have realized something was amiss by now. Jake started with a certain quiet assurance. "When someone is in need, my grandfather doesn't desert them." Miller chuckled dismissively. "Child, your cherished grandfather isn't coming to save you, and only I know you're here." What Miller failed to see was that Chuck Norris was more than just Jake's grandfather. He was a guy with connections, money, and a unique set of abilities that made him powerful. Jake understood that it would not be long. "Could I perhaps have some water?" Jake nodded at the cup that was still just out of his reach while shifting the topic. Miller used one finger to push the cup in his direction, spilling more of it as he went. Jake took it up nonetheless, and the cool water helped his throat, which was raw from the pepper spray and from constantly defending himself vocally. "Let's try a fresh strategy." His tone, Miller said, abruptly changing to a nearly friendly tone. "Perhaps you didn't want to steal, or perhaps you picked something up by mistake and forgot to pay for it." Jake understood the strategy his grandfather had taught him about how people may occasionally give an easy way out at the expense of telling the truth. "Thank you for attempting to fix this, officer." "Miller," Jake remarked, "I can't admit to something I didn't do." Observing the astonishment on a man's face when he used his name for the badge, Miller's phony friendliness quickly disappeared, though. "If you want, we'll wait here all day. And if necessary, you'll ultimately confess the truth." Jake gave a serious nod. "Yes, sir. I have been telling this since the beginning." As the stalemate went on, neither party realized that things were already happening outside the station that would end this confrontation in a surprising way. Miller and Jake both looked up as Senior Officer Richard Parker entered the interrogation room, as the door softly clicked open, cutting them short in the middle of their statement. Parker, a 20-year force veteran with steady eyes and salt and pepper hair, looked around the scene with immediate alarm. "Miller." "What's going on here?" Parker questioned, rapidly evaluating Jake's state. The bulging crimson eyes, the tight posture of someone attempting to retain dignity under hardship, is accompanied by tears. Miller immediately changed his attitude. "From hostile to professional, sir. I caught this suspect close to Johnson's convenience store following a suspected theft, but he hasn't cooperated." Parker took a closer look at Jake, observing how young he seemed. "How old are you, son?" 12, sir." Jake answered in a stern but steady tone. Parker's eyebrows rose a little. "And you've been interrogating him for about an hour without a parent or guardian present," when he looked at his watch. Miller shrugged and refused to give me his phone number or name, but he did mention something about his grandfather. Jake realizes that my grandfather is waiting for me at his dojo, and he's probably beginning to worry. "What is the dojo?" Parker said in a tone that was much softer than Miller's, which had been the Norris family dojo on Oak Street. After being asked a straight question by someone who was eager to listen, Jake raised his chest in response to hope, and Parker's expression slightly changed. "Is dojo's family?" He gave Jake a closer look. "What is your name, son, Jake Norris?" "Sir." Miller snorted when he said that his grandfather was Chuck Norris. Can you believe that Parker's eyes widened a little as he examined Jake's features with fresh interest? The composer's jaw, the composed posture, despite obvious discomfort. Miller followed him into the hallway, shutting the door behind them, but not before Jake caught a sight of their expressions. Miller muttered something outside Parker that left no room for debate. Through the door, Jake could occasionally hear their muted voices as Miller perplexed Parker. "Do you realize who is only claiming to be?" The talk proceeded for several minutes, getting hotter as it went on. He got up enough to catch bits of it, but there was no proof or correct method. Sensing that something significant was happening, Jake concentrated on his breathing. His grandfather used to say that patience frequently reveals the truth more effectively than force. Both officers were back when the door reopened, but their relationship had clearly changed. Miller held back his previous confidence, which had been replaced by uncertainty, while Parker now stood with authority. Jake Parker remarked, "I apologize," with confusion, as he pulled a chair closer and sat level with the boy. "Officer Miller informs me that your grandfather stopped you as you were making your way to his dojo." Jake nodded. "Yes, sir. Your grandfather is Chuck Norris, and I practice every day after school." Miller made a sound of incredulity, but Parker silenced him with a glance that said, "Your backpack was left on the sidewalk where Officer Miller first stopped you." Parker's tone was not mocking nor doubting, just affirming that, "Yes, sir, he has been teaching me martial arts since I was 5. Parker went on, "Yes, sir, my GI is there with my phone and our dojo logo." Parker gave a contemplative nod. "I've sent an officer to go get it." Miller came out because he was obviously unhappy with the way things were going, "Sir, with all due respect, we still need to look into the timing and location of the theft." The store owner just clarified that the suspect was wearing a red shirt when Parker interrupted him. "Jake is dressed in gray, and a boy with red hair may be seen in the security tape." "Jake has brown hair." Miller's face went a little pale, but Parker went on, "I just called the Norris family dojo and they confirmed that Jake Norris is expected for practice and that his grandfather is worried about his absence." Dawn finally realized what was going on, and Parker turned back to Jake. "You're not seriously suggesting that this kid is actually Chuck Norris's grandson?" "Yes, that's exactly what I'm suggesting." A feeling of comfort washed over Jake. His grandfather was on his way. Miller stood motionless as the consequences hit him all at once. He had been pepper-sprayed, violently handled, and aggressively questioned Chuck Norris's grandson, one of the world's most well-known martial artists and action stars. This must have been some sort of error. Mills stumbled as he glanced from Parker to Jake and back. How could I have known who he was? When the seriousness of a situation settled over the room, the distant sound of commotion could be heard from the front of the station, raised voices, hurried footsteps, and the unmistakable sound of authority that needed no badge or uniform to command respect. Chuck Norris had arrived. Parker's response was measured but firm. The problem isn't who Miller is, but how you conduct yourself regardless of who he is. Quiet, before a storm, the sound of deliberate footsteps, steady and unhurried, but somehow more commanding than if they had been running, preceded Jake's grandfather's entrance at martial arts tournaments. The door of the interrogation room swung open with control force, and Chuck Norris stood in the doorway, his presence filling the small space instantly. At 67, the legendary actor and martial artist carried himself with the same authority and strength that had made him an icon. His eyes swept the room in one sweeping glance, taking in every detail before settling on his grandson. Jake said in a steady tone with steel undertones. Grandfather Jake answered, a look of relief crossing his face. Chuck approached Jake and put a protecting hand on his shoulder while he thoroughly examined his face. He could clearly see the red circles around Jake's eyes, the teardrops on his cheeks, and the after effects of the pepper spray. Chuck maintained his composure, but he exuded controlled, deadly intensity. "Who did this to you? Decades of discipline kept your rage in check," Chuck inquired, but it appeared from a sidelong glance at Miller that he was already familiar with the responding officer. Miller, a senior officer, remained motionless against the wall, his face devoid of color. Parker, a senior officer, stepped forward in a kind and professional manner. "Mr. Norris, I want to reassure you that the events of today do not reflect the norms or practices of our department." Chuck gave Miller a single acknowledging nod before focusing entirely on him. "You are the officer who pepper sprayed my grandson." Miller swallowed hard, "Sir. There had been a theft report, and I had good cause to think that Chuck had interrupted him." His tone was so intense that it made Miller wince. "Do you have proof? People who might positively identify him as witnesses?" There was a description in the video. Miller started each week with a description that didn't fit Parker's. The culprit was said to be wearing a red shirt. Jake is dressed in gray. You attacked a 12-year-old boy based on a vague description that didn't even match. Then you brought him here and questioned him for more than an hour without calling his guardian. It wasn't a question, but Miller responded, "Anyway, I didn't know who he was. You didn't know he was my grandson." Chuck's eyes never left Miller. Chuck explained that you should approach Miller because he was a person who deserved due process and basic decency. Chuck went on, "If this is how you treat random children on the street." But Miller didn't respond. Jake's identity shouldn't be significant. The fact that you pepper sprayed a youngster without a call officer is the issue, not the fact that you did so to Chuck Norris's grandson. Parker gave a nod of assent. "Mr. Norris is correct." Miller, "This has nothing to do with Jake's relationship. Rather, it concerns civil rights and appropriate police practice. I was simply trying to do my job, sir, and if I had known that Miller was my grandson, you would have handled him differently." His desperation was evident. Chuck interrupted, "Which is the precise issue. Justice ought to be a blind officer." Jake watched the exchange with a mix of admiration and awe. His grandfather wasn't using his notoriety or physical presence to intimidate, even though both were unquestionably powerful, but rather his moral authority and sound reasoning. "It shouldn't matter if someone is related to me or if they have no one to speak for them at all." Mr. Norris, Parker stated, "I want to reassure you that we take this matter very seriously and that Officer Miller's actions today will be thoroughly reviewed." Chuck looked at Parker and said, "Thank you, officer." "Parker," he turned back to Jake, "are you okay, Stan? This isn't just about disciplining one officer, it's about systemic problems that impact how law enforcement engages with citizens, particularly young people." Jake nodded, and despite the ordeal, he rose up straight in the chair he had been sitting in for more than an hour. His posture reflected his grandfather's lessons, and he will be formally complaining. Chuck told Parker that if this happened to Jake, it's happening to other kids who don't have someone like me to stand up for them. Therefore, accountability counts, not special treatment. "Please, sir." Miller has finally found his voice again. "I committed a mistake, but actions have consequences, and this might ruin my career." Chuck put a protective arm around Jake's shoulders and turned to go, saying simply, "That's something I've taught Jake since he was old enough to understand that it applies to everyone, including police officers." Miller made a final, fervent request. "Mr. Norris, You should know that the characters I portrayed stood for justice and honesty rather than power and intimidation. I have always liked your work, and I never would have Chuck stop and turn around. If you don't grasp the principles those stories symbolize, then being a fan is meaningless. The following week, Jake sat cross-legged on the training mat at the Norris family, while Chuck and Jake made their way to the door, leaving Miller to deal with the fallout from his actions and the realization that he had not only crossed a professional line but had also betrayed the very principles his childhood hero represented. The recollection of that day persisted, even though Dojo's eyes were closed in meditation and the redness from the pepper spray had fully subsided. He was convinced that the teachings would endure a lifetime, even though the physical anguish had only been momentary. Before getting on the mat, Chuck Norris arrived quietly and proudly observed his grandson. Jake opened his eyes and gave Chuck a respectful bow, to which Chuck replied, "How are you feeling today, grandfather?" "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," Jake retorted. Chuck nodded thoughtfully, demonstrating that sometimes the most valuable lessons are learned from challenging circumstances. Officer Miller was placed on leave. According to Jake, after seeing the news report, police protocols for handling minors will be reviewed. Chuck agreed, but the change that could benefit others in the future is more significant than what happens to a single cop. Jake thought about how you might have simply fired him due to your character, but you chose not to bring it up. Chuck grinned a little, utilizing his own power. Strength is not vengeance. Jake's greatest strength is using his influence to make sure that everyone is treated fairly. After a little period of relaxed silence, Jake inquired, "Do you think the officer will learn from this?" "That's up to him." Chuck gave an honest response. While some regard penalties as chances for personal development, others merely perceive them as hardships to be endured. "The other kids at school were asking me what it was like to have you save me, like in one of your films." And Jake nodded, realizing the difference. Jake remarked carefully, "You didn't karate chop anyone or break down doors. You just spoke the truth and stood up for what was right." Chuck raised an eyebrow. "And what do you tell them that it wasn't like a movie at all?" Chuck's eyes wrinkled, in agreement. Sometimes the most effective thing to do is to just speak the truth to authority with composure and a steady heart. Jake's face became grave. Another youngster at school claimed that the cops had pepper sprayed his elder brother the previous year, but no one took him seriously because they don't have a well-known grandfather. Chuck nodded seriously, which is why our next course of action is so crucial. Chuck clarified that you and I are presenting at tomorrow's City Council meeting as citizens who are worried about how law enforcement engages with our community's youth, not as a famous couple and their grandchild. Jake straightened his stance, feeling both honored and anxious to be part of it. "What should I say? Simply share your tale." The truth about Jake doesn't need to be embellished. As they started training, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. What had happened to him was unfair, but his grandfather had taught him how to turn that experience into growth rather than bitterness. Chuck Norris, who is well known throughout the world for his strong roundhouse kicks and action hero roles, showed his grandson that his greatest strength wasn't anything physical, but rather his unwavering dedication to principle and his realization that influence comes with responsibility. For Jake Norris, that was the most important lesson of all.